Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this talk. This is the first of a new series. They are talks on dukkha, on suffering. Suffering is the fourth major topic in our 4 ways of changing the mind. It's an important topic for us all. Suffering is what spoils life, and most of our efforts and the efforts of the whole world around us, humans, animals, are there to reduce suffering as much as possible and to bring as much well-being and happiness as possible. So it's a very important human topic. As far as Dharma goes, then it is the central topic. The Buddha's teaching, so beautifully summed up in the 4 great truths, is all about suffering, its causes, freedom from suffering, and the path towards that. Those teachings help us to understand suffering so that we can transcend suffering, so that we can get rid of suffering forever, and in the meantime reduce it more and more and more in ourselves and in the world around us, as much as is humanly possible. Today, we will look generally at this topic to see what it is basically we're talking about, dukkha. And we'll do that by considering the 3 main aspects of dukkha and how they're connected, because they are very, very much connected. What we'll see is that dukkha, or suffering, in the Buddhist sense, covers so much more than the worldly use of the term. In the world, suffering is part of a pair. Happiness, suffering. Well-being, sickness. Friends, enemies, and so on. It's part of a duality. And in the Buddha's teaching, we're not just looking at what maybe by now, after the previous contemplations on karma, we're realizing are the results of karma, the pleasant results or the unpleasant results. The Buddha's teaching steps back and looks at suffering in those results, but also it looks at suffering in what causes the unpleasant results. Part of it's focused on the time of creation, creating the causes of future suffering. And then another aspect, the 3rd aspect, is about, in general, the human condition and just being, anybody, anywhere. That's what we're going to look at. The first one is obvious suffering. In the Tibetan text, it actually says suffering where you suffer, suffering which is in itself suffering. And that is what this world of ours usually thinks of as suffering, when it actually hurts. When your body hurts, when your mind hurts. Famously, for us human beings, the Buddha taught the sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and death. Obviously, when people are unwell, ill with all the different diseases, they hurt, they suffer, dying, leaving everything you've been, all of your loved ones, the things you have, and so on, is a suffering. Birth, starting all over again, is a suffering. And aging, losing your strength, your faculties, is also a suffering. When the body hurts, or when the mind hurts, When one is sad, when one is upset, full of regret, the mind, this mind of ours, can hurt in many ways. And once in this particular topic of dukkha, once we start to survey not just the world as we know it, humans and animals, but we hear about other worlds, other types of existence, we come to understand that in what are called the lower realms, there is a suffering that's unimaginable, even once we have witnessed the horrible sufferings that we have in this world. Famine, warfare, insanity, psychosis, whatever it is. Much worse, much, much worse. So the first type of suffering is obvious suffering when it actually hurts. And the way this is generally presented, and what we must go through in the coming talks, are teachings on the 6 main types of existence, the 6 realms so famously portrayed in the Buddhist wheel of life, and so important for Buddhists that very often they were next to the doorway of the monastery to remind everyone who came in and out that the main point of the Buddha's teaching is to help us out of suffering forever, and to show what suffering is when it really hurts. So we have 6 realms portrayed in a wheel, 3 upper realms where things aren't so bad, and where there is a mixture of what in worldly terms we call happiness and suffering. It's not all suffering in our use of language. There are good times and bad times. So the best it gets, so we call the Deva realms, where there's the least suffering and the most happiness. There are the human realms, where there can be much happiness and relatively not so much suffering. There are also demigods. And then we have 3 lower realms, where there's more suffering. They are the realms of the animals and the spirits of various sorts, and what are called the hell states. We'll come to those in our coming talks. The point here is that we are looking at what we humans call suffering when it actually hurts. That's type 1 of dukkha. But the Buddhist understanding of dukkha goes beyond the worldly understanding of dukkha, of suffering. It's not just when it hurts. Just in these last talks, we've been considering karma, cause and effect. And in the very last talk, the inevitability of karmic consequences coming back to their doer. So the second type of suffering looks at the time when we are creating causes, creating karma that will bring suffering back to us in the future. Now, at that time, there may not be obvious suffering for the doer, for ourselves. On the contrary, we may be having a good time. Good time. We may be enjoying ourselves. Maybe for us, the best of times. But maybe what we're doing to have the best of times, for instance, stealing from other people, so you have temporarily a lot of wealth. What we're doing may be storing up for us in the future poverty and much suffering. And we saw in the last talks, sometimes big results can come from small causes and so on. So here we're looking through eyes of wisdom at actions that people do to get what they want, to get their own way, that hurt other beings in the process, and that through the power of karma will come back to them as suffering in the future. So it's like, what can we take as an example? Let's say young people, teenagers, getting into serious drug abuse. They're being rebellious, it's the nature of their age. As they take the drugs, they're having a good time, maybe with music or whatever they're doing. So they're having a good time, they're exercising their freedom, their ability to explore, and they don't want to hear that what they're doing is bad. But seen through the eyes of knowledge, of maturity, of experience, one knows the terrible risk they are taking, the horrible damage that can be done to the body, to the mind. One sees the suffering that's being lined up, even though it's not there yet in the person. People smoking, putting poison into their body day after day for a temporary buzz, a few seconds of enjoyment, shortening their lives, bringing emphysema, sicknesses later on in their life. You're looking at somebody having a good time, popping out for a fag and like this, having a good time in their terms, but sowing the seed of future suffering. This second type of suffering, therefore, is called the suffering of change. It's because to get your own way, to get your pleasure, so you get pleasure, you do something that will come back as the opposite, as suffering, as hurt. So the happiness changes to suffering. Another aspect, similar, dealing with now the karma of mind, is when people cling too much to what they're doing, to their status, to what they have, to another human being. So even though the person they're clinging to is their happiness, their status, like being a president or a prime minister, is their happiness, their glory. The very fact that they cling to it is the pride that comes before a fall. It's the buzz that comes before the defeat. So any wise person looking at that situation of somebody puffed up with pride, a person in love but clinging desperately to the other person, you can see the future's already being seeded, created. It's inevitable. Change. The person you love becomes the person who breaks your heart. The job you had, which was your everything, your whole identity, is taken away from you, and you're a nobody, and so on, and so on. The suffering of change. So it's not an obvious suffering in itself. It's a suffering for those who have the wisdom and the experience and the knowledge to know that once you put those causes and conditions in place together, the outcome is inevitable. The third type of dukkha is said to be one that we ordinary human beings can't get. It's too subtle. And it's really the suffering of not being what we could be. Not being what we could be. So it's only those who've realized their potential, who've become free, who've become wise, who've become bodhisattvas, Buddhas, arhats, who are living, breathing, experiencing the fruition of their Dharma path. They realize how limited how much suffering there is being in any worldly state. And I'd like to share, if I can, one of my own life examples, which for me left a lasting impression. Now we go back to Dharamsala in India, sometime around 1970. It was a much quieter place. Anyway, to cut a long story short, one evening I was invited in the hills way up above Dharamsala to a party. And so I went with my friends to a little cottage up near Duhkha and walked in the door. And inside it was like a Bruegel painting. There was everything. People in there, some had been drinking, some taking LSD. And you had people high as a kite, happy, blissed out their brains, dancing. And then in a corner, people, somebody else, freaking out, in hell, looking really like somebody going through a rough time, being helped by some friends. There were all shades within. And I stayed a while, and afterwards I left. So as I walked out the door and shut that door behind me, there's this beautiful Himalayan winter night full of stars. You could hear the wild cats, the leopards, making their noise in the background. Beautiful smell in the air. So vast, so quiet, the mountains disappearing like this over the horizon. Even though inside that room there was the up and the down, that whole microcosm was somewhere you were glad to get out of. For the people in the party having a good time, well, they're having a good time. They're fine. Maybe they thought, this is as good as it gets. Can't be better. And of course the people having a rough time, they're having a rough time. But compared to that, for me, being outside was such a freedom from all that intensity. There's a Buddhist example, it's one that Akon Rinpoche used to quote quite a bit. He said, you're like a bee trapped inside a barrel. You can go to the top of the barrel where it's nicer. You can go to the bottom of the barrel where there's a few rotten things. But wherever you go, whether you buzz up or buzz down, you're always inside the barrel. Shut in, locked in. You can't even see the outside. You don't even know what the outside is like. So we're in what we call samsara. It's a state of mind where we look for happiness that depends. It depends on other people. We go up and down depending whether they're nice to us or not nice. It depends on the weather, depends on our body and our health. It depends on so many things beyond our control. And we're stuck in that. We're locked into that quest for happiness, that fragile quest for happiness in what is possible in worldly life. And that very state of depending and struggling to find happiness that never lasts because of the suffering of change is what this third type of dukkha is all about. And the third type of dukkha is only there because there is nirvana, there is out, there is freedom. It's wonderful, wonderful. And compared to that, even the world, the beautiful worlds of the devas, the finest kinds of human life, and when the day is beautiful and it's spring and the birds are singing and you have good friends, many people say, how can you say all is suffering when it's like this? And you can say you have a good point. But of course, spring turns to summer, summer turns to autumn, autumn turns to winter. friends turn into enemies. The birds can be there, they can fly away. That happiness, that beautiful happiness of that spring day depends on so many things, so many things. So this happiness that comes from insight, that is natural, that is not made by causes and conditions, is nirvana. And anything that's not that is very, very limited. We're trapped inside the barrel. Sometimes when we consider these three types of suffering, they're compared to rice. So the third one, which is called the innate suffering of samsara, the suffering, the dukkha of existence itself, or of being born into an existence made of the five aggregates, if we look at it technically. That third one, it said, is like rice that's been contaminated, poisoned rice, or rice that's got some fungus on it that's dangerous. The second type of suffering, the suffering of change, when in order to get our way, to get our happiness, we're using and hurting others, that's cooking the rice. So once we're in a world of the five aggregates, like a body like this and a life like we have, where we see things and hear things and we want this and we don't like that, that's the kind of world where we are now cooking that potential. We're cooking the poisoned rice. And the first type of suffering we had, the obvious suffering, is when you've eaten the poisoned rice and you're sick to your stomach. Maybe even your life itself is threatened. So we don't have three different areas of suffering. We have three stages of suffering. Sometimes the Buddha is quoted as saying that all existence is suffering, and that seems very over the top to some people, quite understandably. So as I just explained when talking about the spring day, it doesn't mean all existence is suffering in the human understanding of the word suffering, because obviously it's not. There are good times and bad times. There's up and down, depending. Everyone's life is different. When we have that statement about all existence is suffering, we're looking at dukkha type number 3. Existence as seen through the eyes of Buddha, of great bodhisattvas, of arhats, those who are liberated. Then, like that noisy party in Dharamsala, or like being locked in the barrel and only able to buzz up to the top of existence or the bottom of existence, then it's very clear, it's the actual feeling of you wouldn't want to exist in any of those forms, because the natural freedom and qualities and wonder and blissfulness and wisdom and kindness that are innate to our mind are there. Why would anyone want to lose that, to go seeking some temporary, unsatisfactory happiness? I think that's mainly it for today. If we look at those three, maybe one more point. The first thing we need to know is the obvious suffering. Why? Because that gives us more awareness of our fellow beings, and it gives us the compassion we need so much. We lack so much love, so much compassion. We need them desperately, and to do that we need to become much more aware of life around us and what our fellow beings, animals, humans, are going through. So we need to understand obvious suffering to develop basic compassion. The second type of dukkha, suffering of change, really only emerges when we really get karma, the teachings on karma, cause and effect. Once we understand how it works, and we start to realize how it's happening all around us all the time, and how people are in this very moment, and sometimes ourselves, we're messing up in order to get our own way and to get our suffering. We're hurting others, we're hurting ourselves, and it's no good. The third type of dukkha we need to understand in preparation for our deep meditation work, where we come to penetrate the very nature of existence. First things first is to become aware of the condition of our fellow beings, the main states of existence, and in each state what the audit is, what their happinesses can be, and what their sufferings are. Thank you very much. I look forward to speaking more soon. Take good care. Thank you. Bye-bye.